I sold the company and you get nothing.
You didn't sell it. You sold it to me.
At Christmas dinner, my father raised his glass and announced he sold the company, and I got nothing. So I smiled and said one sentence that destroyed everything. You didn't sell it. You sold it to me. My name is Madison Blake, and by the time the candles were lit on that Christmas table, I already knew something was wrong. The house in Boston hadn't changed. Same polished marble floors, same towering glass windows, same quiet, suffocating perfection. But the air felt staged, like everyone had rehearsed their lines and I had walked in without a script. I stepped inside, my heels echoing softly, and that's when I saw my mother, Catherine Blake, early 60s, elegant as always, silver blonde hair perfectly styled, posture straight like she had never allowed herself to bend under pressure. She had built her life around keeping peace, smoothing conflict with a gentle smile and carefully chosen words. Tonight, that smile came a second too late. "Madison, you made it," she said, hugging me briefly. Her perfume was the same, soft, expensive, controlled, just like her. But her eyes didn't hold mine. That was the first sign. Then came my brother, Ethan Blake, 35, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, even though it was Christmas Eve. He had the kind of confidence that came from being chosen his entire life. Clean haircut, expensive watch, effortless smile, the image of a successor. But behind that polish was something else. Entitlement. Ethan had never been forced to prove anything. The system had always bent in his favour. "Well, look who finally came back," he said, raising a glass before noon. "Just in time to see the future of Blake Dynamics." He didn't say it directly. He didn't need to. I smiled, just enough to be polite. "I didn't realise the future had already been decided," I said. He laughed like I had told a joke. "That's because you left before you could understand how things work here." There it was. Same tone, same dismissal. Nothing had changed. I moved further into the living room, taking it all in. The decorations were perfect. Too perfect. Gold accents, symmetrical arrangements, candles placed with surgical precision. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a showroom pretending to be one. My phone buzzed. A message. Lily Carter. I hadn't seen her in years, but I knew exactly who she had become. Lily, 33, sharp-minded, dark brown hair always pulled back, eyes that missed nothing. She used to be the only person who ever told me the truth without softening it. Now she was a corporate lawyer, ruthless when she needed to be, loyal when it mattered. Her message was short. "Be careful tonight. Something's off about this deal." I stared at it for a second longer than I should have. Deal. So it was happening tonight. That explained the tension. That explained the performance. From down the hallway, I heard my father's voice. Richard Blake, 65, still commanding even when unseen. Tall, slightly greying at the temples, always dressed like he was about to walk into a boardroom. His presence had shaped every room he entered, and every person inside it. He didn't raise his voice often. He didn't need to. Authority followed him like a shadow. He stepped into view a moment later, adjusting his cufflinks, barely glancing at me. "Madison," he said, like I was an afterthought. "You're here." No hug, no warmth, just acknowledgement. "Big night," Ethan added, unable to hide the excitement in his voice. My father gave a small, satisfied smile. "Yes," he said, "it is." And in that moment, I understood everything without a single word being explained. This wasn't just Christmas dinner. This was an announcement. And whatever it was, I already knew one thing for sure. I wasn't part of it. I didn't always understand that I didn't belong, at least not in the way my family defined belonging. Growing up in Boston, inside a house where everything had to look perfect from the outside, I learned early that image mattered more than substance. I was the middle child, but not the balanced one, the inconvenient one. While other kids played outside, I spent hours in my room with an old laptop, teaching myself how systems worked, how data moved, how patterns could predict outcomes before they happened. I thought that kind of curiosity would make me valuable. I was wrong. Ethan Blake, my older brother, had been preparing for his role since he was a teenager. Tall, confident, always well-dressed, even at 17, he had the kind of charm that made adults nod along, even when he said nothing meaningful. My father enrolled him in leadership programs, sent him to networking events, introduced him as the future of Blake Dynamics, long before he had earned anything. Ethan wasn't stupid, just comfortable. Comfortable enough to never question anything, never challenge the system that was already designed to reward him. And in a family like mine, comfort was mistaken for competence. I still remember the first time I realized how little my contributions meant. I was 19, home from college, already ahead in my computer science program, and I had spent weeks analyzing internal logistics data from the company's outdated system. That was when I noticed it, an inefficiency in their routing algorithm that was causing consistent delays and unnecessary fuel costs. Not catastrophic, but enough to quietly drain money over time. I built a simple model to demonstrate the issue and proposed a fix. I thought they would be impressed. Instead, my father barely glanced at the screen. "Madison," he said, cutting into his steak, "this isn't a classroom. We don't change systems based on theory." Then he turned to Ethan and asked about a client dinner, as if I hadn't spoken. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not yet, but clarity. Around that same time, I met Lily Carter in a very different context than family dinners. She was in her early 20s then, already sharp, observant, with dark hair tied back, and a habit of watching people more than she spoke. We met through a university legal tech seminar, where she stood out not because she talked the most, but because when she did, everyone listened. Lily didn't come from wealth. She came from discipline. Scholarships, late nights, relentless focus. The kind of person who didn't believe in illusions because she had never been allowed to rely on them. One evening, after I told her about my family and the company, she looked at me for a long second and said something that stayed with me. "You're trying to win a game that's already rigged against you." I laughed it off at the time. I told her she didn't understand, that I just needed to prove myself. She didn't argue. She just said, "Or you could leave and build something where proof actually matters." I didn't listen. Not then. Because a part of me still believed that if I worked hard enough, if I was useful enough, someone in that house, my father, my mother, anyone, would finally see me differently. But every dinner, every meeting, every small dismissal reinforced the same truth. In the Blake family, identity wasn't built on what you could do. It was assigned long before you ever had the chance to try. The conference room on the 27th floor of Blake Dynamics was designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling glass, a skyline view of Boston, and a long obsidian table that reflected every face sitting around it like a mirror you couldn't escape. I stood at the front, laptop connected, presentation ready, and for the first time in years, I believed I had something they couldn't ignore. I was 23, dressed simply but sharply, my dark hair pulled into a low knot, posture steady, even though my pulse refused to cooperate. This wasn't just another idea. It was a complete operational model. Predictive routing, adaptive warehouse allocation, real-time data layering. It was the future, and I had built it for them. My father, Richard Blake, sat at the centre of the table like he always did, mid-60s, tall, controlled, his grey-streaked hair perfectly combed, his presence commanding without effort. He had built the company from a regional player into a respected name, and that success had hardened into something else over time. Certainty. The kind that left no room for being wrong. To his right sat Ethan, relaxed, confident, one arm draped over the chair like he already belonged there permanently. He gave me a brief nod before the meeting started, not dismissive, just uninterested. I began anyway. I walked them through inefficiencies in the current system, showed projected loss margins, then introduced my model, clean, scalable, practical. For the first few minutes, people actually leaned in. Slides moved smoothly, data spoke clearly, and I felt it, that rare moment when logic cuts through noise. Then, halfway through my explanation of adaptive load balancing, my father leaned back in his chair and laughed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Enough to shift the room. "Madison," he said, lifting a hand as if stopping a child mid-story. "That's enough." The screen behind me froze on a graph that no one was looking at anymore. "This is exactly the problem with over-educated thinking," he continued, his tone calm but final. "You confuse intelligence with leadership." I didn't move, didn't breathe. He stood then, slow, deliberate, reclaiming the room with a single motion. "Blake Dynamics is not a lab experiment. We don't gamble on ideas that sound impressive, we protect what already works." Then, without even looking at me again, he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "The future of this company," he said, "is already in the right hands." Silence followed, heavy, absolute. Ethan straightened slightly, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just confirmed. That was the difference between us. I had come here to prove something. He had come here to be chosen. I closed my laptop slowly, the click louder than it should have been. No one stopped me. No one spoke. As I walked out, I passed a man near the back, Marcus Reed, early 50s, lean, slightly hunched from years of corporate endurance, sharp eyes behind thin-framed glasses. He had the look of someone who had seen too much to be surprised anymore. Senior Operations Director. Quiet. Observant. The kind of man who survived by understanding when not to speak. As I reached the door, he stepped closer, just enough that no one else would hear. "You're right," he said quietly, "but they don't want to hear it." I paused. Not because I needed confirmation, but because hearing it out loud made something final inside me. I nodded once and kept walking, out of the room, down the hall, past the glass walls and polished floors that suddenly felt smaller than they ever had before. That was the moment everything became clear. It was never about my ideas, never about my capability. It was about control. And my father would rather let the company fall behind than admit that the future didn't look like him. I didn't go home after that meeting. I went straight to my apartment, packed 2 suitcases, and booked the first one-way flight out of Boston I could afford. Because staying even one more night in that city felt like agreeing to the version of me they had already decided would never matter. And I refused to become that person. Austin wasn't a dream. It was a reset. Hot, loud, unfamiliar, and completely indifferent to my last name, which was exactly what I needed. Because for the first time in my life, nobody cared who my father was, or what I was supposed to inherit. And that freedom felt terrifying and addictive at the same time, especially when it came with a bank account that barely covered 2 months of rent in a cramped, aging studio apartment with uneven floors, flickering lights, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot instead of a skyline. I changed my name before I changed anything else. Maya Stone. Simple, untraceable, emotionally detached. Because Madison Blake came with expectations, history, and a shadow I needed to step out of if I was ever going to prove anything real. Maya Stone, on the other hand, had nothing, which meant she had everything to build, even if that meant working 18-hour days, taking freelance contracts no one else wanted, fixing broken back-end systems, cleaning up inefficient APIs, rewriting warehouse dashboards for companies that couldn't afford better but desperately needed smarter tools. That's how I met Daniel Cruz, 29, tall and slightly underweight, like he had spent too many years choosing work over sleep. Dark hair always falling into his eyes, usually wearing worn-out hoodies that made him look younger than he was. But the moment he started talking about systems, you could feel the shift. Precision, clarity, brilliance that didn't need validation. He had been passed over by bigger companies because he didn't play politics well, didn't sell himself, didn't fit the leader image, and that made him invisible to the wrong people and invaluable to the right ones, which is why I noticed him immediately when we were both subcontracted on a failing logistics dashboard project that everyone else had already given up on. We didn't become partners overnight, but we recognized something in each other, the same frustration, the same refusal to accept broken systems as good enough, and the same quiet understanding that the industry was lagging behind reality, which is why nights slowly turned into something else. Not just survival work, but creation. We started sketching ideas after midnight, building rough models, testing integrations, pulling fragmented data streams into something cohesive, something predictive, something that didn't just react to problems, but anticipated them before they happened. It wasn't elegant in the beginning. Half the code barely held together. Most of our tools were patched from open source frameworks, and we worked off cheap coffee and stubbornness. But it worked, and that was all that mattered, because every small success, every system that ran smoother because of what we built, reinforced something I had realized the moment I left Boston. I hadn't walked away with nothing. I had walked away with clarity, and for the first time, I wasn't trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided it didn't exist. I was building something that would eventually make them irrelevant. NovaGrid Systems didn't explode overnight. It grew quietly, deliberately, like something that didn't need attention to become powerful, because attention had never been the point. Usefulness was. And in an industry drowning in outdated systems pretending to work, usefulness became our advantage long before anyone noticed we existed. By the end of the second year, our small operation had turned into something structured, still lean, still invisible to the mainstream, but undeniably effective. Our clients weren't the biggest names, but they were the ones who needed results the most. Regional distributors, mid-sized carriers, warehouse operators who couldn't afford inefficiency but had been forced to live with it for years. And every time our system predicted a delay before it happened, or optimized a route that saved thousands in cost, word spread, not loudly, but consistently, which was enough. Daniel Cruz evolved faster than even I expected. The same quiet engineer I met on a failing contract project had become the backbone of our architecture. Still lean, still understated, but sharper now, more decisive, his dark eyes constantly scanning for inefficiencies the way other people looked for opportunities. He didn't care about recognition, didn't ask for titles, but every line of code he wrote pushed our platform further ahead, cleaner, faster, more adaptive. And while larger companies were still patching legacy systems, Daniel was rebuilding the logic underneath them entirely, turning fragmented data into something predictive, something alive. That was also when I brought Lily Carter back into my life, not as a friend this time, but as legal counsel. She had changed in ways that made sense for someone who had spent years navigating corporate law at the highest levels, more controlled, more precise, her posture sharper, her words measured like every sentence had already been tested for consequences before it left her mouth. At 33, she had built a reputation as someone who didn't lose, not because she was aggressive, but because she was prepared. And when I told her what Novagrid was becoming, she didn't congratulate me. She asked one question. "How exposed are you?" That was Lily, always looking for the vulnerability before the victory. With her in place, everything became more structured. Contracts tightened, acquisitions, small ones, strategic, started to take shape, and Novagrid stopped being just a product and became a system of solutions, layered, scalable, quietly expanding into spaces the larger players still underestimated because they were too focused on maintaining image to notice where they were actually losing ground. And that's when I started looking back, not emotionally, not with regret, but analytically. Blake Dynamics was still respected on paper, still carrying the weight of its name, but beneath that surface, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Outdated infrastructure, reactive decision-making, clients staying out of habit rather than trust, and most importantly, leadership that believed stability meant refusing to evolve. I didn't feel anger when I saw it. I felt confirmation, because the same system that had dismissed me was now becoming its own weakness, and for the first time, I understood something clearly. I wasn't building Novagrid to compete. I was building it to replace what companies like Blake Dynamics would eventually become if they refused to change. I didn't go back to Boston, not physically. But I returned in a different way, through numbers, reports, and quiet access points that told a clearer truth than any conversation ever could. Because by then, Novagrid wasn't just a company, it was a position. And from that position, I could see Blake Dynamics more clearly than anyone still inside it. The partnership proposal was precise, almost surgical in how carefully it was constructed. It didn't threaten control, didn't expose weaknesses, didn't force my father into a defensive position. Instead, it offered modernization under the language of strategic enhancement, integration support, phased upgrades, cost efficiency improvements, all wrapped in the kind of corporate neutrality that should have made it easy to accept, especially for a company already starting to show signs of strain. I didn't send it as Madison Blake. I didn't even send it as Maya Stone. It came from Novagrid's acquisition and strategy division, filtered through intermediaries, structured to look like an opportunity, not a correction. They rejected it in less than 48 hours. The official response was polite: misaligned priorities, insufficient long-term trust, unclear strategic compatibility. But the meaning underneath was simple. They didn't trust what they didn't control, and more importantly, they didn't respect what they didn't recognize. My father had built his entire career on believing that authority came from being the one who decided, not the one who adapted, and that belief had now become a liability he couldn't see. Ethan, meanwhile, had started making decisions that confirmed everything I had suspected. Through industry reports and shifting vendor patterns, I began noticing inconsistencies, contracts being restructured too quickly, pricing models that didn't align with market conditions, partnerships that looked impressive on paper but didn't hold operational value. He was trying to prove himself, but without understanding the system, every decision created more instability beneath the surface, like reinforcing a structure with materials that looked strong but couldn't carry weight. That's when Marcus Reed reached out. Not directly, not recklessly, but carefully, the way someone like him always operated. A private message, routed through a secure channel, nothing traceable back to him unless someone already knew where to look. He hadn't changed much, still quiet, still observant, still the kind of man who survived by knowing when to act instead of when to speak. The data he sent wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Internal reports, vendor inconsistencies, delayed system updates, subtle financial irregularities that only became obvious when you looked at them collectively instead of individually. "Thought you should see this," was all he wrote. I did. And once I did, the pattern became undeniable. Blake Dynamics wasn't just behind, it was drifting, held together by reputation and habit while the structure underneath weakened. And the worst part wasn't the inefficiency, it was the denial, the refusal to acknowledge that the system they were protecting was the same system quietly failing them. I sat in my office that night, the Austin skyline reflecting against the glass, the same kind of view my father used to believe defined power, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider something I had avoided until then, not out of hesitation, but out of restraint. I had given them a chance, a clean one, and they had refused it, not because it wasn't good enough, but because it didn't come from someone they were willing to listen to. That was the moment the equation changed. If they wouldn't evolve, then they would be replaced by something that could.
By the time dinner began, I wasn't nervous anymore. I was precise, because everything that mattered had already been decided long before I walked back into that house, and the only thing left was timing. The table looked exactly the way it always had during holidays. Polished silver, perfect symmetry, my father at the head like a man about to deliver something important, Ethan sitting close enough to catch approval without asking for it, my mother across from him with that same composed expression she had worn for decades, and me, placed just far enough to be included, but never central, except tonight. Placement didn't matter anymore. Richard Blake didn't wait long. He never did when he believed he controlled the narrative, and as soon as the plates were cleared, he tapped his glass lightly, the room falling silent with the kind of obedience that had defined our family for years. He stood slowly, adjusting his cufflinks, his voice steady, confident, rehearsed. "After months of negotiation," he said, "I've finalized the sale of Blake Dynamics." Ethan's reaction came before the sentence finished. A brief, satisfied smile, already calculating what that meant for him, already assuming he was still part of whatever came next. My mother held her expression, but I saw it, the tension in her jaw, the awareness that something about this didn't feel stable. Nova Grid Systems, my father continued, almost impressed with himself, has acquired the company at a valuation that reflects its true worth. That was my cue. I didn't rush it. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the information to settle, for Ethan to start forming questions, for my father to feel the weight of his own announcement. Then I set my glass down and spoke, my voice calm, controlled, unmistakably clear. "You didn't sell it," I said. "You sold it to me." At first, no one moved. Ethan blinked, then let out a short laugh, too quick, too defensive. "What are you talking about?" he said, his tone shifting from amusement to irritation in seconds. My father didn't laugh. He stared at me, his expression tightening, trying to find the angle where this was still under his control. "Don't be ridiculous, Madison," he said. I reached into my bag and placed a single card on the table. Minimalist, clean. Maya Stone, founder and CEO, Nova Grid Systems. The room changed before anyone said a word. Ethan stood up too fast, his chair scraping sharply against the floor. "This is a joke," he snapped, but his voice didn't hold. Not fully, because somewhere beneath the denial, he already knew something was wrong. I met his gaze, then looked at my father. "The deal was structured through intermediaries," I said. "Legal teams, acquisition channels. You reviewed everything. You just never thought to ask who was behind it." That's when Lily stepped forward. She had arrived quietly, standing near the edge of the room until the exact moment she was needed. Lily Carter, now fully in her element. Early 30s, composed, dark hair pulled into a sharp low bun, dressed in a tailored black suit that carried authority without needing attention. Her posture was straight, her expression neutral, but her eyes were focused, controlled, deliberate. She didn't belong to this family dynamic, and that was precisely why she held power in it now. "I represent Nova Grid Systems in this transaction," she said calmly, placing a folder on the table. "The acquisition is complete, fully executed, legally binding." Ethan's composure broke first. "No," he said, shaking his head, pacing now, his confidence unraveling in real time. "No, this isn't real. You don't get to just walk in and—" "I didn't walk in," I cut in, still calm. "I built something you never saw coming." Then I turned to him fully. "And while we're here," I added, "we should probably address the vendor contracts you approved over the last year." That stopped him, not the accusation, the certainty behind it. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but quieter now. "I do," I replied. "Inflated invoices, misaligned partnerships, Short-term deals that looked profitable but destabilized operations. Patterns that only make sense if you're trying to prove results instead of actually creating them. Silence again. Heavy. Different this time. My father didn't interrupt, didn't defend him, he just listened. And my mother, for the first time in my life, she looked at me not with caution, not with avoidance, but with recognition. Something had shifted in her expression, something honest, something that didn't try to smooth the moment into something acceptable. "Is it true?" she asked Ethan quietly. He didn't answer. That was enough. The morning after the dinner, the house felt different, not quieter, not calmer, but stripped of something that had been there for years, something unspoken that had finally been forced into the open, and for the first time, I wasn't walking into that silence as the outsider. I was stepping into it as the one who had changed it. I didn't come back to Boston to destroy Blake Dynamics. If I had wanted that, I could have done it quietly months ago, but destruction is easy. It doesn't require vision, it doesn't require responsibility, and more importantly, it doesn't build anything worth keeping, which is why the first decision I made as the new owner wasn't about power, it was about structure. Contracts were reviewed, outdated systems replaced, departments reorganized, not based on loyalty, but on capability, and the people who had been carrying the company without recognition were finally given roles that matched what they actually contributed. Daniel Cruz arrived in Boston a week later, still wearing the same understated style. Simple dark jacket, no interest in attention, but his presence carried weight now, not because he demanded it, but because the systems he built spoke for him. At 29, he had gone from overlooked engineer to chief architect of something global, and watching him walk through the same office that once dismissed people like us felt like a quiet correction the world had finally made. Together, we didn't just upgrade Blake Dynamics, we integrated it into NovaGrid's infrastructure, turning it from a company surviving on reputation into one operating on real-time intelligence, predictive systems, and decisions grounded in data rather than assumption. Ethan didn't stay to watch it happen. He left before the first major restructuring meeting, not dramatically, not publicly, but with the kind of silence that follows when someone realizes they can't argue with facts anymore. He wasn't a villain, not really, just someone who had been protected from failure for too long to know how to handle it when it finally arrived. And months later, I heard through industry contacts that he had started over in a smaller firm, no title, no inheritance, just work, which was probably the first honest thing his career had ever required of him. My mother, Catherine Blake, came to see me not long after the transition began, and for the first time in my life, she didn't come to smooth things over or change the subject. She came with honesty, her posture still composed, her voice still controlled, but there was something different in her eyes, something unguarded. "I knew," she said quietly, standing in my office. "I always knew you were the one who understood this better than anyone." She didn't dress it up as justification, didn't try to excuse the years of silence. "I thought keeping the peace was protecting the family," she added. "I was wrong. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was real, and for the first time, that was enough." My father took longer. Richard Blake didn't apologize in the way people expect apologies to sound, but change showed up in other ways, quieter ones. He accepted the transition, took the advisory role we offered, and for the first time since I'd known him, he listened before he spoke, not because he had lost authority, but because he had finally understood the cost of using it the wrong way, and when he told the board that leadership should stay with me, not as a necessity, but as a decision, that was the closest he would ever come to saying he trusted me. Months turned into momentum, and NovaGrid expanded beyond what I had originally imagined. New acquisitions, international clients, systems scaling across markets that had once been fragmented and inefficient. And through all of it, I made one choice that surprised even myself. I kept the name Blake. Not as a legacy of what it had been, but as a statement of what it could become when it was no longer controlled by image, ego, or entitlement. I didn't need them to see me anymore, but in the end, they did. So, what would you choose? Stay and fight for a family that never valued you, or walk away and build your own future? Forgive them, or make them face the truth? Revenge, or rebuild something better? If you were me, what would you do? Comment your choice below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this.